Good morning to those of you in New York, and good afternoon to those of you in Europe and Africa. And I'm sure it goes without saying, a special word of concern to our colleagues sitting in the Ukraine at the moment with this terrible news unfolding as we watch every moment. It's something that I think has seized the attention of every single one of us throughout the world. Your plight, and our hearts go out to you and your compatriots at this time. So we'll jump straight in. Thank you very much for your patience. Tembi, if we could just start with the slides, and hopefully you can see them. As Stuart was saying earlier, one of the key issues, and I'm going to switch my camera off now, so we'll just look straight at the slides. How this is going to work, whatever happens, we're going to be putting the slides of this presentation up at the end of the presentation, so they will be accessible, as well as the notes, and also a tip sheet for basically a one-page tip sheet on how to avoid libel. One of the questions that we had, and you'll see it if you click on your polls, is, are you concerned about libel? So I went in first and I said yes. I see there's another couple of votes that said yes, they are too, and I see there's one that says maybe. So I'm very concerned about libel, and I'm going to explain that. But let me just walk you through how we're going to spend the next hour and a half. I'm going to try and take you through what constitutes the offence of libel or defamation as we know it, how to avoid libeling someone unintentionally, how to limit your liability when you do it in any case, because if we're doing our jobs properly, it's almost inevitable that we're going to libel someone, and how to defend yourself when the libel or the defamation that you have published is actually true. I'd like you to take part by going onto the chat and chatting with me throughout. We'll be going through this process, and I'll try and answer your questions as and when they come up, and hopefully towards the end of the session we can actually data and bandwidth allowing, we can actually have a bit of a conversation towards the end of this. So let's go straight into it by defining what this is. Tembi, if you could just show us the next slide. So we define libel, and I've looked here at the Merriam-Webster definition. It's a written or oral defamatory statement or representation that conveys an unjustly unfavorable impression. It's a statement or a representation published without just cause and tending to expose another to public contempt. It's defamation of a person by written or representational means. It's the publication of blasphemous, treasonable, seditious, or obscene writings or pictures. It's the act, the tort, or the crime of publishing such a libel. Now that's quite important, and we're going to come back to that just to unpack what's coming in that definition. If we go to the second slide, we look at Cornell Law School in the US, defining it as a method of defamation expressed in print, writing, pictures, signs, effigies, or any communication embodied in physical form that is injurious to a person's reputation, exposes a person to public hatred, contempt, or ridicule, or injures a person in his or her business or profession. When we move to the next slide, we'll start seeing what the problems are. Number one, the identity of the person who is the subject of the defamation must be clear. Number two, and I think this is sometimes it's a bit funny when you look at some of the libel, the lawyers' letters that you'll receive, the person has to have a reputation to impugn or damage. And that's very, very important. And you'll normally find that, and I'm sure you have, that the people with the least reputation are normally the most litigious and very quick off the mark to hit you with lawyers' letters. You can't defame the dead. If you look at those definitions, you cannot defame the dead, but you can defame a company. Very important that, and we often miss that. It has the defamation, for it to succeed, and we're going to get to that because when we look at the defenses, has to be fair. There has to be a reason to have said it. Then the statement has to be published. It has to be disseminated to a third party, either verbally or by writing. And it also has to exist, or where someone has hastily deleted it, to have been shown to have existed. Can we move to the next slide, please, Tembi? So as we move to the next slide, we're going to see that why should we care about libel as journalists? The first issue is because everyone involved in the process is going to be sued. Whether you yourself are the editor and it's one of your staff that's published it, or whether you caused it to be published through the system in the newsroom. So if you're the writer or the reporter, you will be sued. The editor will be sued. The publisher will be sued, and the owner. If you lose the case, it's going to cost your organization money. It might even cost you individually, because sometimes cost orders can be issued against that person. It might even cost you your job or any chance of future employment, because media organizations can get gun shy about hiring people who they fear are going to end up tying them down in court. And this is the key issue for me, but why defamation is so important, because unscrupulous individuals and organizations will use defamation suits as a form of lawfare, as a legitimate way to muzzle media. The cost of defending them, and normally because in court, what happens is when there are big damages being claimed, they then go to the higher or the Supreme Courts, which means that you have to have more lawyers on your side, more senior lawyers, and it becomes quite ruinous to defend. And often, if you don't have the backing of a progressive management team, you might end up in a situation where your management will decide to settle the case rather than see it through. And as we've seen in this country, we've had certain individuals and senior politicians who have used state funding to actually appeal every single decision and to prosecute their own cases all the way through to the apex court on spurious grounds. So it is absolutely debilitating for any media organization, but particularly for smaller independent media organizations. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the question I'd like to ask you, and please just answer in the chats. And I know this might sound counterintuitive to some of you, but are we allowed to hold negative views of people? And if so, I'm just seeing if there's any reply here on the chat. So the question is, are we allowed to hold negative views of people? The answer is yes. We have the right to freedom of expression in most countries and the freedom of belief. But what competes with that is the right to privacy and to dignity. So just as much as we have the right to express ourselves and to believe what we want, the subjects of our beliefs and our expressions also have their right to privacy and to their dignity. So the question then, the second question would be, do we have the right to express views that are negative about other people? And the answer, once again, is yes. We can give an opinion to a third party about another person's suitability for a job, for example, if we are asked this in good faith. If somebody comes and says to you, so-and-so was a colleague of yours, you know, I'm thinking of appointing them. You're allowed to give a view, indeed a negative view, and it's almost expected, and that would be what they call protected comment. As long as you give the opinion honestly, fairly, and based on your own experience, and not hearsay or the experience of others. Commentary is generally free. In South Africa, according to our press code, we have what is called protected comment, and this is similar to protected comment in many other countries in the world. And it reads as follows: the media shall be entitled to comment upon or criticize any actions or events of public interest, and comment or criticism is protected even if it's extreme, unjust, unbalanced, exaggerated, and prejudiced, as long as it is without malice, is on a matter of public interest, has taken fair account of all material facts that are either true or reasonably true, and is presented in a manner that appears clearly to be comment. There's a couple of issues that we're going to see immediately where things have to be based on facts. You can have an opinion that is very, very, very exaggerated and very extreme, but as long as it's based on facts and what appears to be true at a particular time, then you can actually get away with it. The key thing, so if we can, Tembi, if we can move to the next slide, please. The key thing is that this is all about opinion. The facts that we base our opinions upon have to be fair and have to be true. And even when they're fair and they're true, there has to be a reason to share them. And this is where we enter the debate of what is called public interest. And there's a huge difference between what interests the public and what is in the public interest. It's vital that we understand this, because as journalists, I know that I've done it in the past, we often use public interest as a catch-all excuse for myriad sins that we commit, prying into people's businesses and lives, and often getting away with murder, figuratively speaking. The Ethical Journalism Network defines public interest as follows. Put simply, the public interest is about what matters to everyone in society. It is about the common good, the general welfare, and the security and well-being of everyone in the community we serve. So if we move to the next slide, Tembi. What examples are there? And please, speak to me on the chat box, but what examples are there of issues that you think interest the public, which overlap with the public's interest? Paula, can you think of any? For me, the examples are of what interests the public versus the public's interest are issues like drunkenness by temperance preachers, for the obvious reason that the hypocrisy that is inherent in that, licentious behavior by moralists, proof of bribery or corruption by politicians, and revealing of past embarrassments if these have not been disclosed and even denied. But if you can't show that the revelations that you are publishing matter to everyone in society, then you're going to have, and that they serve the common good and speak to the general welfare and security and well-being of everyone in the community, you're going to struggle to mount a public interest defense. And it's also key to understanding why public figures, especially celebrities and politicians, primarily because they derive their power and their wealth and their status from courting public support, have less right to privacy than ordinary citizens. But it doesn't take it away from the point that they're still entitled to fairness. And it's something we can never, ever lose sight of. So as we move our slides along, the next question is, can a picture be defamatory? What do you think? Can a picture be defamatory? Yes, of course it can be defamatory. So too can a video. So too can an audio clip. Anything taken without context, showing, once again, if we go back to our original concept of what is defamation, anything that causes an unjustly unfavorable impression, that exposes a person to contempt, injures their reputation, and once again injures their business or their ability to perform their business, can be defamatory. And that's why it's always critically important that all pictures should be properly captioned. All videos should have the context explained before they're put up. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to defend at the end. And this is often what happens, especially in a newspaper environment, as you all know, things can get lost in translation. There are many, many moving parts that go through publication process. The sub-editors, copy editors, whatever, news editors. That's why it's so vital that photographers get their captions absolutely spot on and correct. And it's vital when we use photographs to explain, especially where they are file pictures. I remember a couple of years ago, there was, and this is just an aside, but it shows what can happen when we get things wrong. So a couple of years ago on the newspaper that I had the privilege of working on, we had a human interest section, which was it was totally banal. It was about cooking, and we had a kitchen, and there was we would take pictures. We would send photographers, and they would take pictures of people participating in this in cooking classes and whatever. And this picture was taken of a couple, and with their permission, but they didn't look very happy with one another. And the picture was taken, and it was put into it was used as to, I think, on some society page or whatever, and then it was put into the archive. Several years afterwards, there was another human interest piece that was being run about the perils of divorce and splitting up couples. And the sub-editors went and they said to the photo desk, find us a picture of people looking terribly unhappy that are married. And they used this as an illustrative pic about divorce. But the thing was that the couple in this picture were happily married, but now they were hugely embarrassed, as you might imagine, throughout all their friends and colleagues and family, by what was really a reasonably innocent mistake. So this is why it's so very important to make sure that the pictures that we use to illustrate, especially now that we're moving into multimedia or whatever, that we use pictures that speak to the illustrate the article that we're trying to have illustrated in the way that we mean it to be illustrated, and indeed that we have rights to, and that we don't inadvertently create harm in the process. So the next question is, how do we publish the picture that we have that could be defamatory, which we know is defamatory? We would use the same methodology as we would with text or oral. Is it true? Is it in the public interest? Is it contemporaneous? The issue I've just raised to you now obviously wasn't contemporaneous. It was a file picture. Is it fair? Okay. We've got to make sure that this is one of the reasons why in many countries there's a fatwa against identifying people who appear in court before they've actually pleaded. Equally, we've got to be very careful when you take pictures of people or publish pictures of people or footage of people going to court that you don't ascribe to them guilt before they've pleaded. You can just say what exactly is happening, that they're appearing in court, they did appear in court, and they were asked to face those charges, not that they pleaded and not that they were guilty. It's very, very important to be accurate in what we're doing. Otherwise, we have effectively defamed those people, whether inadvertently or just through sloppiness. But it does happen, and it can be incredibly expensive. Let's move to the next slide, please, Tembi. So there's a lot of words that are bandied about: libel, defamation, slander, and we often get very confused. These days, defamation is the general term that we use for impugning someone's character or dignity. Libel traditionally was defamation that was written. Slander traditionally was defamation that was spoken. And these used to be important terms because there were different penalties for each and also different burdens of proof. Libel used to be recognized as more serious, but in the US, case law has evolved to recognize them as the same, whether they're written or uttered. It's the same. And what we're going to get to as well is when the case comes in front of a judge, we will see as we look through the damages and issues. But the big thing when they're looking at damages is how far did this defamatory remark travel? And that's a key issue. It's a very, very important issue. And it's something we'll touch on when we get to social media as well. Okay, so when some statements, some defamatory statements, whether they're published or spoken, are defamatory in and of themselves. And the lawyers call that defamatory per se, without the complainant having to prove that they are. Okay, and some of those examples, if I look at Illinois in the USA, so something that's defamatory per se, and this is, you're going to find this throughout the world, saying or writing that someone is involved in a criminal activity or in fact has committed a crime. By definition, that's already defamatory. Saying or writing that a person is infected with a loathsome communicable disease is defamatory. And it's interesting that we've moved on so much, I think, as a society since the HIV and AIDS pandemic of the early 90s in terms of the sensitivity and how we approach things, that with COVID, for example, you saw there was very much a need by certain sectors of the media across the world to look for patient zero, this kind of witch hunt, and to find out basically who was responsible for starting the contagion in a particular country, who was therefore responsible for the lockdowns that would have followed, the incredible disruption of people's lives. So you can see immediately that it's not just defamatory, it's also incredibly irresponsible, number one. And number two, it's pointless. You know, we're living in a pandemic. How it actually came in and how it was transferred thereafter is actually almost rendered irrelevant compared to how we're going to handle it. And somebody who finds themselves, obviously it hasn't happened in with COVID yet, because I think there was greater levels of sensitivity. But if we cast our minds back to the HIV and AIDS pandemic, with the literally witch hunts and the demonization of ultimately anybody who was HIV positive, which then span out into, once again, the community shunning that person, that person being unable to get jobs and whatever, that is textbook defamation. It's also textbook bad journalism, but it's textbook defamation. Once again, another statement that is obviously defamatory is saying or writing that a person is involved in behavior that would be incompatible with the proper conduct of their business, their trade, their profession, you know. And in certain parts of the world, saying that or writing that a person is an adulterer or unchaste, and these aren't my words, these are the words from Illinois, or engaged in sexual misconduct. Yet again, and this is one of the very strange things about defamation, and you'll remember in the beginning we spoke about people having to have a reputation to lose. Some people have had sex tapes. We don't need to name names, but some celebrities have built their entire cult of celebrity on the basis of a sex tape that was leaked. Others, of course, other people would sue for an invasion of privacy, which we'll get to just now as well. And then in South Africa, another incredibly defamatory statement is to impugn someone of racism or gender-based violence. And this is an issue, and I say particularly in South Africa. I mean, I think gender-based violence and racism, as we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, is worldwide. But in our country, in particular, it's highly defamatory, because somebody who is accused of that and is not guilty of that will find themselves almost unemployable and indeed shunned. So then we've got statements that can be proven to be defamatory. Now the lawyers will call that, remember the first ones we said were defamatory per se, or defamatory in and of themselves. These are now known as statements that are defamatory per quad. And here there's the onus of proof. If the statement is obviously defamatory, as we've just gone through now, the complainant doesn't have to explain why it's defamatory. The court will see that. If it's defamatory per quad, the complainant has to show why the statement was defamatory and then what damage they suffered. Okay, so there was a court case in the Alaska Supreme Court where a woman accused a man of assault, battery, and false imprisonment. The court explained that because the statements imputed a serious crime, the man was not required to prove the damage to his reputation and emotional distress. It was obvious. In Texas, one doctor sued another for a letter he circulated that stated that the doctor had a reputation for being untruthful. The court determined that this was not defamation per se, since it didn't injure the doctor and his reputation. Because of that, the doctor had to prove that he'd suffered mental anguish and loss of reputation. I wouldn't rely too heavily on that one. I would have thought that if somebody said that a doctor was lying, I would have thought that would have fitted straight in with behavior incompatible with the proper conduct of their business, trade, and profession. But you can see how things change and how there are leeways. But then all that meant was that from the word go, the doctor had to prove how he had been defamed and how he had lost out as a result. So it just made it slightly more difficult for the doctor to prove the defamation. And unfortunately, I don't have the results of that case. I wish I had. But and in some countries, you only have to say that it's true, and that's a defense. But in South Africa, and I use South Africa for a variety of reasons. A, that's where my experience comes from, and secondly, we are particularly litigious around defamation, and we are a bit of a minefield when it comes to media. So that's why if you'll indulge me on using my South African experience, but if you take that we normally have our backs against the wall when it comes to this, you'll understand that if you follow our lead, then probably you'll be even safer when it comes to publishing defamatory articles. So here in this country, you have to believe it to have been true at the time you said it. Okay.